Yesterday, standing at the Ellipse where 4 years ago Donald Trump fomented an insurrection against the United States, Vice President Kamala Harris gave the most important political speech of her career, the closing argument speech, and it triggered a Fox News meltdown of epic proportion. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. This is, again, the quote-unquote closing argument speech, the last major speech before the 2024 election by Vice President Harris, the counterpart to Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden rally. I've got a couple of things to say about that because she delivered a fantastic speech that we need to talk about, we need to dissect. But first, I want you to see how Fox News reacted to this because it was unhinged, okay? So Mediaite talks about this. Fox News Chyron, so the lower banners where they describe what's going on during Kamala Harris' speech, reveal what the network thinks, right? And you could probably use your imagination. They're not big fans of Vice President Harris, but this was stunning. Let's see. Fox News, however, opted to offer its own derogatory opinions of Harris' speech through a series of increasingly unhinged and absurdly biased chyrons, or lower thirds, as they're called in the business, designed entirely to undermine Harris's campaign. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples. Kamala's policy she failed to enact as VP, even though vice presidents have no executive and legislative direct power. They serve as advisors to presidents. They cast tie-breaking votes when necessary. But again, some people think that the vice president should be able to snap her fingers and enact policy, whereas Donald Trump was president for 4 years and failed to get a lot of his agenda done. But, Fox doesn't care about that. They hold Vice President Harris to a higher standard to then President Trump. Kamala vows to lower costs after 3.5 years. Kamala calls for unity while trashing Trump. While Donald Trump is the opposition, it's perfectly fair to criticize him, and calls for unity doesn't mean that you can't criticize your opponent. Again, it's an absurd standard that Fox holds Harris to that they would never impose on Trump. Kamala's focus is on Trump, not voters. Well, as we'll get into that, that's not true. She does criticize Trump during much of her speech. She also dedicates the majority of it to talking to voters about what she will do for them. Again, we'll get into that with examples. Kamala's final pitch to voters is all about Trump. Again, categorically not true. Not only is this simply biased, more than that, it's just dishonest, and we have the video to prove it. Desperate Kamala, closing message all about Trump. Again, not true, but desperate Kamala? Interesting. Kamala pushes fear in closing message. Kamala calls for unity while trashing Trump. Now, Kamala delivers final pitch to voters. What an unhinged series of chyrons from Fox News revealing their insecurity about this perilously close election. And listen, I can empathize. I am also very concerned about this election because Donald Trump could easily win if we don't do our parts as eligible voters. But for Fox News, a news network, to go that openly in the bag for Trump is just stunning and laughable at the same time, increasingly unhinged. So let's get to Vice President Harris's speech. First thing I want you to note, the attendance was staggering. According to Secret Service, more than 75,000 Americans showed up to the Ellipse. Staggering. I want you to think about this. Madison Square Garden, which is a legendary venue, it's an infamous, iconic venue, and Donald Trump felt really good about selling it out in New York City. It has a capacity of less than 20,000. Okay, so even if Donald Trump put an ass in every seat in Madison Square Garden, it was a fraction of the number of people who showed up in support of Vice President Harris. Again, they point out Trump claims that Kamala Harris, quote, can't get anybody to show up at her rally tonight. And there are over 75,000 people in attendance. That's more than was at attendance at Madison Square Garden. That was more than was at attendance at Donald Trump's rallies in Butler, Pennsylvania, even after the failed assassination attempt against him. I'm not committing to the idea that the vice president can necessarily consistently pull the same number of people as Donald Trump. Maybe she can, maybe she can't. I don't know. But I do know this crowd was formidable and more people showed up here than showed up for Trump. So with that in mind, let's get to some of the highlights. So again, it is true that she addressed Trump repeatedly in her speech. So let's get the Trump stuff out of the way, and then we'll get into specific policies that she proposes, and then we'll get into the closing part. But this is Vice President Harris rightly going after Trump.
Look. We know who Donald Trump is. He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election. he lost. Americans died as a result of that attack. 140 law enforcement officers were injured because of that attack. And while Donald Trump sat in the White House watching as the violence unfolded on television, he was told by his staff that the mob wanted to kill his own vice president. And Donald Trump responded with 2 words: "So what?" America, that's who Donald Trump is. And that's who is asking you to give him another 4 years in the Oval Office. Not to focus on your problems, but to focus on his.
So again, this is important. January 6th, I know, is not a salient issue for, unfortunately, a lot of Americans, even though it by itself should be eminently disqualifying. But it is important. She's making a statement here. She's trying to thread 2 needles. She's trying to make an affirmative case for her agenda, her economic agenda in particular. But it is important, and this is tested. You know, she also has to hit Trump as the authoritarian fascist that he is, particularly in light of the increasing number of former Trump supporters who have come out of the woodwork and publicly called Trump a fascist. She has to do both of these things. They are both important. That's why this speech begins with an attack on Donald Trump and then culminates with an economic and reproductive right agenda. We'll get into that. But it's also worth noting that Donald Trump, as the sitting president of the United States, had an obligation to quell that insurrection. Instead, he was the one who fomented it and permitted it to go through for 3.5 hours. He knew it was going on. He was watching it unfold. People were begging him to intervene. He did not. That is dereliction of duty of the highest order. Here's another clip from Vice President Harris.
And Donald Trump has told us his priorities for a second term. He has an enemies list of people he intends to prosecute. He says that one of his highest priorities is to set free the violent extremists who insulted those law enforcement officers on January 6th. Donald Trump intends to use the United States military against American citizens who simply disagree with him. People he calls, quote, the enemy from within. America, this is not a candidate for president who is thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who is unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power. Donald Trump has spent a decade trying to keep the American people divided and afraid of each other. That is who he is. But America, I am here tonight to say that is not who we are. That is not who we are.
Again, great points all the way around. So see how she's doing this. She's establishing what Donald Trump has done in the past, right? Because some people say, oh, okay, he talks a big game, but he would never attempt to do anything authoritarian or fascistic. No, he did. And a big example is January 6th. So that's laying the foundation. Then she talks about what Trump has promised he will do if he becomes president again. And he has repeatedly, publicly vowed to use the Department of Justice to pursue his critics, the media, his political opponents, Americans who don't support him. Again, the quote unquote enemy within. There is no counterpart to this in the Democratic Party. There is nothing anywhere close as fascistic and authoritarian as vengeful in the Democratic Party. And she's laying out the contrast. And it's important to remember that this election is not only for the presidency, it's also for both chambers of Congress. And Donald Trump and his party stand a good chance of winning all three. And if they win one, they can do enormous damage and impede enormous progress. But if Trump wins all three, he already has a sympathetic, super majority conservative, Supreme Court. So it's entirely possible that Donald Trump will once again have hands on all the levers of federal power. What will check him then? Especially in light of the Supreme Court decision, which permits him to effectively commit crimes with impunity. There's no check. Why do we want to leave this to chance? It's absolutely absurd. And she's right to draw attention to this and to, draw attention to the very real fears that you should have if Trump becomes president again.
So look, in less than 90 days, either Donald Trump or I will be in the Oval Office. Okay? On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list.
It's a great line, great contrast. And now she starts to lay out, again, an affirmative agenda. Although I will say, got to close the loop on this, one thing, especially in light of what we recently learned earlier today, and I did a video about this, but Vice President Harris makes one last point about Trump that I think is worth noting, which is Trump's ambition to overturn Obamacare and strip health insurance away and health care away from tens of millions of Americans.
You will pay even more if Donald Trump finally gets his way and repeals the Affordable Care Act, which would throw millions of Americans off their health insurance and take us back to when insurance companies had the power to deny people with pre-existing conditions. Well, we are not going back. We are not going back.
This is important because, again, as I discussed in a previous video earlier today, we have leaked footage of Mike Johnson. It's not audio. It's not speculation. He says it out loud on camera. We see his face publicly promising his supporters at this event that if he and Trump, win the upcoming election, they will repeal Obamacare. They intend to target Obamacare, which will strip healthcare away from 45 million Americans and permit insurance companies to deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions, diabetes and other things, right? That was the free market solution prior to the Affordable Care Act. And Mike Johnson kind of screwed Trump over by giving the game away by admitting that, Trump's lying when he says, he's not going to target Obamacare again, even though he did when he was president. We are going to target Obamacare. Very important thing to note. So now let's get into the vice president making her affirmative case about her policies.
We're not going back because we also know Donald Trump would deliver tax cuts to his billionaire donors. I will deliver tax cuts to working people and the middle class. I will make sure you have a chance not just to get by, but to get ahead. Because I believe in honoring the dignity of work. I will enact the first ever federal ban on price gouging on groceries. Cap the price of insulin and limit out-of-pocket prescription costs for all Americans. I will fight to make sure that hardworking Americans can actually afford a place to live. I'll never forget how our mother saved up and how excited she was when she could finally afford to buy our first home. I remember how excited she was. And I know that owning a home is not only a measure of financial security, it's about the pride of your hard work. And as president, I will fight to help first-time home buyers with your down payment, take on the companies that are jacking up rents, and build millions of new homes. For years, we have heard excuses about why America can't build enough housing. Enough with the excuses. I'm going to cut the red tape and work with the private sector and local governments to speed up building and get it done. And the cost of housing isn't the only financial pressure on middle-class families. I have met so many young people who have a natural desire to parent their children well, but not always the resources to do it. So I'll fight for a child tax credit to save them some money, which will also lift American children out of poverty. I'll work to lower the cost of childcare, which is out of reach for too many working families today. And for too many people in the sandwich generation, who are raising young children and taking care of a parent. Juggling all of it is extremely difficult. You know, I took care of my mother when she got sick, cooking food that she had a taste for, finding clothes that would not irritate her skin. And understand, as I do, that caregiving is about dignity. It is about dignity. And currently, if you need home care and you don't have some money to hire someone, you and your family need to deplete your savings to qualify for help. That's just not right. So we're going to change the approach and allow Medicare to cover the cost of home care so seniors can get the help and care they need in their own home.
So I wanted you to see that full exchange uninterrupted because it's important to hear it straight from the vice president's mouth. That is an affirmative policy agenda. Yes, sometimes she uses it in contrast with Trump, like tax cuts. He wants to increase tax cuts on middle and lower classes by giving tax cuts for the rich. I will cut taxes for middle and lower classes and increase taxes on the rich. That's a juxtaposition. But otherwise, everything she said here was an affirmative, economic agenda about what they call kitchen table issues, about specific things, healthcare, home buyers, running the entire gamut. So this idea that the vice president doesn't have an affirmative policy agenda is patently absurd. Going to play a couple more clips just to really drive this home. And in this one, she focuses on reproductive rights.
Now, Donald Trump has a different approach. He tried to cut Medicare and Social Security every year he was president. Look, I believe that when people have worked hard their entire life, they deserve to retire with the benefits they have earned. And I believe in the fundamental freedom of Americans to make decisions about their own bodies and not have their government tell them what to do. I will fight to restore what Donald Trump and his hand-selected Supreme Court justices took away from the women of America.
So again, another major affirmative case saying that she will use her powers of the presidency. And if you give her a Congress, because she can't do it alone, she has to have a Democratic majority in the Senate. She has to have a Democratic majority in the House. And then between them, they will pass legislation which codifies Roe v. Wade protections into federal law again, overturning these capricious, these cruel trigger laws, these restrictive anti-choice laws in Florida, in Texas, and in other red states. But she has to win the White House to do it, and you have to give her Democratic control of Senate and the House as well. So listen, I could spend even more time. I mean, she gives a 3-minute closing section here, but I don't want to belabor the point. You should watch the full speech in its entirety. This is the most important speech of her political career thus far. This, again, is the closing argument speech. I think she did an incredible job just in terms of performance, but also in terms of substance as well. She does two things. She hits Donald Trump where it hurts, and she also makes an affirmative policy case for her agenda. And this is what drove Fox News so nuts that they had increasingly unhinged chyrons, went all the way back to the beginning here, because they couldn't handle how well she was doing. Crazy stuff. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.